Big sporting competitions have the potential, like nothing else, to bring the world together in a unity of spirit designed to celebrate human achievement and elevate the collective mood. The Olympic Games in Paris will, for many, live on as a beautiful memory of the summer. But the extraordinary opening ceremony, specifically its rainbow palette, wasn't to everyone's taste, and it came to serve as a reminder of how deeply divided the world is.
Самое большое не потрясение, нет, потому что уже привычное, а омерзение – это вот эта самая Олимпиада.
Miért kell belevinni a gyalázását az eukarisztiának egy sporteseménybe?
If people have taken any offense, we are of course really sorry.
Among the heavyweights to express indignation was a bishop of the Catholic Church as well as the Turkish president. He berated the French organizers for, as he put it, debasing humanity to a level below animals.
Dede gitme dedi. Niye dedim? Orada dedi LGBT gösterisi yapacaklar dedi.
Recep Tayyip Erdogan explained that he decided not to attend the event after his granddaughter warned him about the LGBT show that was going to take place. The immorality displayed at the ceremony, he said, once again highlighted the extent of the threat we face. An MP of his AK party went even further, calling the ceremony, and I quote, a propaganda for all kinds of perverted movements, such as LGBT, pedophilia, and Satanism. None of this would have come as a surprise to those familiar with the discourse.
Populist politicians across the world, they are increasingly appearing to propel a new type of politics of perpetual culture war. They're finding new areas to seek support on, and they're trying to rally their supporters against these issues.
In this episode of The Global Jigsaw, we ask what's behind the evolution of Erdogan's narrative on LGBT issues, and how did Turkey's Islamic conservatives find common ground with American evangelicals? It's a look at one battlefield of the global culture war. I'm Krassi Twik, and this is The Global Jigsaw from BBC Monitoring, where we look at the world through the lens of its media, getting past the narratives, the propaganda and the disinformation.
Radio Tehran. Мы не вторгались на территорию Украины.
Western countries are not the international community. That era has finished.
조중 두당 두 나라 최고 영도자 동지들께서는
It's a warm evening in Istanbul. Families strolling, children eating ice cream, a community 1,000 strong coming together, along with its street cats, to hear an important message. Dozens of NGOs have worked to make this great family gathering an annual event in recent years. The people there seem united in their belief that the world is turning topsy-turvy and someone needs to make a stand.
That sentiment, both in political rhetoric and among the wider public, quote-unquote, the threat posed by non-traditional sexuality and identity has become this really hot-button issue for conservatives in Turkey in recent years.
William Armstrong is a Turkey specialist working in our Istanbul bureau. He, along with Nihan Kale, have been keeping an eye on these meetings.
The rhetoric we hear from the organizers of the Great Family Gathering is that they say they want to draw attention to what they call the dangers of LGBT impositions and perversion imposed by global lobbies.
Nem kérünk a szakállas nőkből és a miniszoknyás férfiakból sem.
They claim that one of the biggest threats against the concept of family is the imposition of sexual deviance, which is how they describe the LGBT. A speaker at one of these rallies said the LGBT propaganda is a tool used by imperialists and that there is a Western-led propaganda encouraging young people to become LGBT.
Biz sakallı kadın, mini etekli erkek istemiyoruz.
They demand LGBT associations be closed down and activities banned, and that come also amidst what independent voices say is a wider crackdown on civil society in Turkey.
This conservative pushback is not unique to Turkey or to Islam. We see it in many countries dominated by Christianity, in the US, in parts of Europe, and it's particularly heavily pronounced in Russia, where it's used as a moral battle of values against what the Kremlin calls the collective West.
Dear Turkish friends, I am very happy that you are organizing this meeting against LGBT.
Alexander Dugin, the philosopher who has President Putin's ear, was once beamed as a guest into the Great Family Gathering in Istanbul.
The themes that are highlighted in the Great Family Gathering show that political Islamists in Turkey and conservative activists in the US actually share some common ground on some big social questions. So, like you say, strange bedfellows in many ways. During campaigning for the presidential election last year, President Erdogan repeatedly hammered home similar messages. He warned about the threat posed by what he called, quote-unquote, LGBT terror. He said LGBT is a poison injected into the institution of the family in one speech.
LGBT denilen olay bir defa aile kurumuna sokulmuş bir zehirdir.
He said that if the institution of the family is not strong, then the nation will essentially be destroyed. He also vowed zero tolerance for any LGBT activism, and he described LGBT people as part of quote-unquote perverted tendencies. And the former Interior Minister Süleyman Soylu even said that gay marriage would directly lead to people marrying animals.
Hani LGBT, IQ falan filan diyorlar ya. Onun içerisinde hayvanla insanın evlenmesi.
Really extreme, harsh rhetoric, and it all led to an oppressive, stifling atmosphere. Erdogan and his ruling party have also for months touted a planned constitutional change as follow-up to all this. They say will protect the family and outlaw quote-unquote LGBT propaganda. And there are now concerns about potentially all LGBT rights activist groups being banned, and even some people talking about same-sex relationships being outlawed entirely. So potentially quite dramatic stuff.
Homosexuality is not illegal in Turkey. Yet pride marches have been banned since 2015, and any public demonstrations of support for the LGBT cause are met with a pushback. When these attitudes are verbalized by the top leaders, it alarms liberal Turks.
LGBT individuals have said that the Great Family Meeting is a state-sponsored hate crime, actually. Anti-LGBT sentiment is not unusual or new, but they say that what's worrying is that the gatherings were reported and amplified by Turkish state broadcaster TRT and the state-funded Anadolu Agency, and was broadcast as a public service ad by the Turkish media watchdog.
This kind of rhetoric has been widely reflected in media coverage as well. A very large majority of mainstream media outlets are very close to the government, to the ruling party of Erdogan, almost organically linked, and therefore a lot of the rhetoric that you see from officials basically gets regurgitated verbatim and given a new spin, maybe put in even more extreme terms in media outlets, officials speaking and media outlets essentially amplifying it and keeping it on the agenda. And that was definitely the case during the election campaign in 2023.
Throughout his election campaign, he often accused those who stood against him of being pro-LGBT, and members of the LGBT community have voiced a lot of concern over this kind of rhetoric and sentiment, and they say that they are having to live in constant fear of intimidation. And there have been a lot of media reports that we've monitored showing that LGBT individuals are increasingly wanting to leave Turkey for this reason.
There was an example that illustrates this point. It involved a Turkish national volleyball player who found herself in the eye of a media storm over her sexuality.
Ebru Karakurt. She was part of the very successful Turkish national team that won the Women's Volleyball World Cup in 2023.
High ball to Karakurt. She blocked up a picture.
She basically became the target of a furious media and social media firestorm over the fact that she is a lesbian. She posted a photo on Instagram with her girlfriend. She's tall, she has short hair, often dyed in different colours, and that all attracted the attention of critics, and they denounced her very, very harshly. A prominent pro-government outlet here blasted Karakurt as a quote-unquote national shame due to her lifestyle that goes against the values of Turkish society. That gives you an idea of the tone that the discourse takes on these issues in Turkey.
But the public hounding of the volleyball player earned her sympathy and support too.
That example saw a great amount of support for Ebrar Karakurt. People really pushing back very strongly, voicing support for her, both on social media and on the pitch. What we're seeing is an escalation, really, where these issues, it's not just one-way traffic. They create this enormous argument and a very, very angry public discourse that does resemble the kind of culture wars that we see in a number of countries where the walls go up on both sides and it just becomes an extremely angry shouting match.
While much of Turkish society has long had a strain of social conservatism, the anti-LGBT sentiment is relatively recent. The Turkish pop culture scene over the last few decades, for example, has sometimes nurtured and celebrated stars on TV with colourful appearance and unorthodox lifestyle.
Bir toplumun kalitesi yetiştirdiği gerçek sanatçılarla ölçülmektedir.
Zeki Müren is one of the most prominent singers and performers in Turkey's history who has appended these norms. He particularly rose to prominence in the 60s and 70s as a singer of traditional and popular music. He wore flamboyant costumes and had a feminine demeanor, and he increasingly blurred those gender boundaries. He wore women's dresses, makeup, and painted his nails. And none of this affected his popularity. He was wildly popular across all of Turkish society, broke sales records until his death. There was another prominent name who was referred widely as Huysuz Virgin, which means grumpy virgin in Turkish.
Sana laf edenin ağzı çarpılır. Aman çocuklar yaşım ilerledi, altın gelmeye başladı.
It was the stage name of Seyfi Dursunoğlu, a major TV personality from the 1970s right through to the 2000s. He was a middle-aged man dressed in drag with a sassy and light-hearted demeanor. There were millions of people tuning into his TV shows, which featured risque jokes. But in the mid-2000s, the character gradually began going off-air. Media reports today say that the Turkish television watchdog had actually indirectly put pressure on TV channels and censored them to stop broadcasting this character.
Ay yok 35 çocuklar. Aha.
If we go further back in history and look at the Ottoman court, we'd find even more liberal attitudes towards sexuality.
Sexuality in the Ottoman Empire was very different from what we recognize as common today. It's a bit hard to get your head around that these days, but historians have shown how the categories of man and women were quite fluid in the classic Ottoman age centuries ago. As women were more secluded in the private sphere in the Ottoman era, male-to-male sexual relationships were more common, and most people didn't even consider this gay in the modern sense of the word. And some of these homoerotic themes can actually sometimes also be found in Ottoman poetry and miniature art.
The Ottoman Empire came to an end with Kemal Atatürk's reforms, steering the country towards a vision of secular modernity. It has been argued that the foundations of modern Turkey he laid are themselves the result of a culture war.
Mustafa Kemal Atatürk in 1923 established a secular state in Turkey. He ushered in several reforms that gave Turkish women equal rights. The new civil code completely abolished polygamy and recognized the rights of women in divorce, custody, and inheritance. The entire education system in Turkey also became co-educational, so girls and boys were studying side by side. In the mid-1930s, women were granted the right to elect and get elected. So that was revolutionary at the time for women to have such huge opportunities and rights.
No doubt women benefited from these reforms hugely. But how has the secular state been treating minority groups like homosexuals? Are LGBT rights anchored in law?
Homosexuality has never been outlawed in modern Turkish history. But the Constitution also never explicitly referred to sexual orientation or gender identity in relation to equal treatment before the law. That also means that there are judicial inadequacies regarding protecting LGBT persons from discrimination on the grounds of sexual orientation and gender identity. Throughout modern Turkish history, we've also never really had a proper debate on legalizing same-sex marriage at the national level. The state was always quite vague on homosexuality. And the rights of these individuals were never banned or outlawed, but there was no explicit protection of their rights in the Constitution either. To illustrate this, there's the example of the singer Bülent Ersoy, who was hugely popular but was banned from the stage in 1981 after a military coup, along with other trans artists. She was forced to perform as a man despite undergoing gender-affirming surgery. She was recognized officially as a woman in 1988 only.
You are listening to the Global Jigsaw from BBC Monitoring. According to polls, in today's Turkey, the LGBT community is treated with a certain amount of tolerance and acceptance, in line with other modern liberal tendencies. And that's what made some politicians worried.
Sort of an acceptance of LGBT in society going up at a time when birth rates are declining and divorce rates are going up and people getting married not at a very young age, translating into a sort of worry and panic among conservative and Islamist figures.
Like we're saying, the international situation has changed as well. These issues are also much more widely, much more angrily debated in other countries in the West, in the US, and therefore it seems to be almost a perfect storm for these issues to come to the agenda as well in Turkey.
20 years ago, the president himself, back then Prime Minister, sounded more sympathetic towards the LGBT community.
Erdogan and his ruling party voiced very different sentiments. When they first came to power, they were actually enthusiastic about joining the EU, presenting themselves very much as a modern conservative movement, almost in the mould of Christian Democrats in continental Europe. Turkish politics was a very different place back then, and indeed politics in many countries was in a different place back then. There's actually footage of Erdogan speaking to students at a university event in the early 2000s, pledging to protect the rights of LGBT people.
Yani eşcinsellerin de kendi hak ve özgürlükleri çerçevesinde bir defa yasal güvence altına alınması şart.
Things have now basically flipped 180, and now the political circumstances have created this much more angry public discourse.
Tell me a little bit more about the conditions that led to this U-turn. What's behind the evolution of these attitudes?
I think over the last few years, Erdogan really has sought to consolidate himself in power, and one way of doing this, amid particularly the recent economic difficulties that Turkey's had over the last few years, has been to really lean into these culture war issues, basically to try and reinforce those dividing lines. Erdogan's base is very conservative, it's often very religious, and in these kind of hot-button social issues, they know which side they're on. And if Erdogan can foreground those as much as possible, then that's going to benefit him politically.
It would seem that one of the reasons behind the president's anti-LGBT push is maintaining his popularity.
He did not win the elections in the first round. He had to go for a second round.
Türkiye Cumhuriyeti Cumhurbaşkanı olarak geçici sonuçlar sonucunda Sayın Recep Tayyip Erdoğan'ın
And it shows that there is a declining support for Erdogan. Even though he still remains popular in the country, he's not as strong as he used to be, perhaps, and especially when Turkey's suffering from an acute cost of living crisis, a persistently high inflation, economic troubles are really becoming very big problems for the people in the country.
Biz İstanbul'u çok seviyoruz.
These types of topics are instrumental in consolidating his core supporters who are Islamist, who are religious, who are conservatives.
The family institution of this nation is strong. There will be no LGBT people in this nation.
I see this as part of how populist politicians across the world increasingly appearing to propel a new type of politics of perpetual culture war. And I find that the general trend is that they weaponize these issues to mobilize their bases and capitalize on their fears that emerge usually out of a lack of information. And where people are divided on almost every issue, it can be easy to gain popularity, especially when those speaking out have the loudest voices among society.
Over the last few years, the president has leaned very hard into extremely divisive rhetoric, and he's done that on a number of these key issues that we're talking about: domestic politics, foreign policy, economic policy. All these areas are filtered through warlike rhetoric where it's us versus them, the, quote, real people against the liberal elites, traditional Muslim values against immoral secularists, the LGBT issue and others. Useful political dividing line for Erdogan and the people around Erdogan to signal to voters which side they're on. Part of the reason why it's so effective at consolidating support.
Ethnic minorities, urban women, sexual minorities, people with widely varied interests and lifestyles who are finding themselves on the other side of the divide are part of the electorate that could vote for a change. As Nihan pointed out, the president got a taste of the challenge this social force could present on polling day.
I think people in Turkey are still mostly conservative and traditional. These sorts of trends have remained prominent over the decades and years, but there are also secular lifestyles and values that are prevalent in Turkish society. It's hard to pinpoint exactly where this public attitudes change and shift because Turkey is a very deeply polarized country.
A lot of the people currently rallying against LGBT rights also previously advocated for Turkey to withdraw from the Istanbul Convention, which is a Council of Europe treaty on violence against women. And they ultimately succeeded. Prominent media figures attending the Great Family Gathering, for example, were also vocal advocates of withdrawing from the Istanbul Convention. Their argument was that this poses a threat to the social fabric. In some ways, there you see anti-LGBT sentiment resonating with broader anti-feminist sentiment, which is all part of this much broader conservative firmament. One of the smaller hardline Islamist parties, Yeniden Refah Partisi, or the New Welfare Party, is also a prominent critic of the current system of alimony given to divorced women and saying that that victimizes men.
Feminists say that the Istanbul Convention was the crucial agreement that protected the rights of women and actually sought to combat violence against women. Femicides have been commonplace in Turkey. It has plagued the country. It still continues to do so.
Women once benefited from the secular reforms of the founder of modern Turkey, Kemal Atatürk. And it is women now, along with groups under the LGBT umbrella, that are on the receiving end of this backlash against what some see as secularism gone too far.
This emphasis by Islamist circles on the sanctity of the concept of family confines women only to the family. Rights advocates have said this categorizes women into the good women and the bad women. And several independent feminists have long said that President Erdogan's party do not see women as individuals, but those with the sole function of childbearing and keeping families intact. They say this sort of understanding excludes women who are not married and do not have children. Women's rights and LGBT rights in Turkey are very much bound together and intertwined.
What William earlier called unlikely bedfellows, political Islam and evangelical conservatives fighting the same corner, is a recent phenomenon. It can be seen in the context of a growing distance between liberal Western values and the moral longings of a world that is increasingly hostile towards their imposition.
You see, culture war narratives and online material that originates in the US and the Anglosphere really can find receptive audiences among surprising constituencies around the world, and that really just fits into already existing social divides. In Turkey, I've seen clips from content shared by American right-wingers regularly going viral on social media and amplified by prominent commentators. To give you an example, Ersin Çelik, who's a columnist with the hardline pro-government Yeni Şafak newspaper and one of the key figures behind organising the Great Family Gathering, wrote an article voicing sympathy for traditional families in the US, battling what he called LGBT lobbies. And he wrote in that article, quote, "Concerned families are crying out, 'Leave our children alone.' The Democratic Party represents LGBT perversion. The Republican Party defends the family and the continuation of generations. Democrats carry LGBT rags, Republicans carry American flags." So there you've got an influential Islamist pundit basically finding common cause with evangelical Christian activists in the US.
Societies in the West are deeply divided on some LGBT issues as well. Culture wars playing out on social media have been extremely heated. Even the acronym LGBT is disputed as it puts together groups with perceived conflicting agendas. It's a subject with many complexities.
It's very striking to see how the debate in Turkey on the LGBT issue is actually much less nuanced even than it is in the West. You don't really see anyone saying, for example, I'm in favour of gay rights but against some aspects of the trans agenda. All you see is blanket hostility to basically all non-traditional sexuality, non-traditional identity. Anything beyond the traditional expressions of those things is seen as a Western-imposed danger threatening Turkey. Some of the same conservatives who have been railing against LGBT rights, for example, are also railing against falling birth rates. They're vowing to combat quote-unquote globalist plots to de-genderize Turkish society. And there's also a campaign to spread skepticism over climate change that's really been gaining momentum in recent years, and that is presented by similar circles as a direct threat to Turkey's economic development. A lot of the rhetoric that you see around anti-vaccine sentiment and climate skepticism will be very familiar to anyone familiar with alt-right narratives in the West.
The hostility towards the LGBT community has alienated many young people who are now looking to find safer harbours away from home.
That has definitely become accelerated with the recent economic crisis as well, but a number of the people who want to leave are indeed people who feel threatened by the atmosphere that's being cultivated. The other aspect is that the people left behind will obviously now think twice, think three times about any kind of public expression of their identity, of their sexuality. When people see powerful officials speaking at the very highest level with this kind of rhetoric, that has a hugely chilling and extremely stifling effect on people.
Let's hear one final recent quote from President Erdogan.
This lobby, which does not tolerate the slightest criticism, has completely captured Europe and the Western world.
In Turkey, people are polarized on almost every issue. Stoking divisions and promoting national populism are becoming defining trends for politicians' successes in keeping electoral support together. Divisive culture war issues can be instrumental for the government, which is struggling to stave off the economic problems.
The battle over cultural values is really intensifying around the world, and Turkey is just one of the front lines that can illustrate that. We've seen this backlash against progressive, liberal social values gaining intensity as the ruling elites link it to broader geopolitical shifts and the emergence of a multipolar world order. I think there's a lot of leaders of emerging countries that often frame liberal values as Western impositions, arguing that defending conservative traditions is akin to almost national defense. In the past, many people assumed that a globalized world was going in a straight line and steadily converging on progressive liberal values. But in fact, I think perhaps we're seeing that globalization may actually be increasing resentment between cultures as they rub up against each other, increasing friction and triggering some of these really angry reactions that we've been talking about.
Thanks to our experts Nihan Kale and William Armstrong. This episode was produced by Krista Shaturi and me, Krasi Twig. The sound engineer is Nigel Dix and our editor is Judy King. For those of you who might be moved by these issues, please send us your thoughts. Our email address is theglobaljigsaw, one word, @bbc.co.uk. We'd be excited to receive your feedback or ideas for future episodes.